Okay, so you should be able to see a technical army octopus sing out if you can't. So this is just about, as Mike mentioned, just a couple of things that are getting ready to ship for workers. So there's sort of two or three things I'm just going to talk about now. So the first one is that run on server was always sort of this magical thing where there was a calamari invocation that happened under the hood, and you could never really sort of see it or control it in a way. And then when we released workers, you still couldn't. The built-in worker was still this sort of magical thing where if the default pool was empty, you got the built-in worker. Whereas now as you can see here, we're going to surface the built-in worker as a real thing. So if you look at the workers, you'll get your list of workers, and there'll also be the built-in worker there. And there's kind of two reasons for doing that. One is internally, there's a bunch of code paths where we handled the built-in worker a little bit specially. And by making it a real thing, we get to push those as far down the pipeline as we possibly can until the very last moment. So it eliminates a bunch of special cases around when something's going to run on server. The other reason to do it is because of the magic. So as I said in the past, there was no built-in worker. So you sort of, when you got your default installation of Octopus, there was this default worker pool there that was empty. And then when you ran steps there, suddenly this built-in worker thing appeared and ran the step, but then was never visible to you. So this makes it visible, and it's going to, so on a default install, you'll just get the default pool, and the built-in worker will live in there, and it'll just look like a normal worker. So when you see like your worker pools, there's the built-in worker there. I made a little bit of a choice here that we could have, like in the past, when you started adding workers to the default pool, then the built-in kind of shut off. And I thought we could do the same thing, that you add something to the default pool and then this disappears. But then I thought that means we're still just handling it separately. So in this version, it's just like a normal worker. So you can even put it in multiple pools if you want. You can have other workers in the same pool as it. It just becomes a normal worker, which I think just removes all the magic around it. But I kind of have the feeling that mostly people would either have it in the default pool all on its own, or just delete it and not have it at all and just have external workers. But yeah, it just behaves like a normal worker now. And so one thing you can do, because it's now a normal worker, is it comes up in the script console. So you can now run script consoles on the built-in worker, which is kind of nice. It's something you couldn't do beforehand. You'd have to put like a tentacle on your Octopus server or something to do that. Okay, so that's the built-in worker. So that's now a real thing. Yeah.
Just before we move on, which node is that going to run on in a HA setup?
It's just going to run on whatever node you're running on, as it always did. So the built-in worker still just means the local calamari invocation. So if you're at an HA setup, it'll just run locally.
It'll just run whichever one happens.
Yeah. So for the script console, that's a bit. Yeah, because you might like to run a script on each node or something, and it's not easy to control that. So we might have to beef that up a bit for HA. Allow an option or something so you can run it on each node in a cluster or something. But that's a little bit harder to achieve, and I'm not really sure how that would go.
Yeah. Cool. Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. Yeah, so that's thing number one, is the built-in worker becoming more of a real thing. Thing number two is that in the past you couldn't target your step at particular pools, but then it was always just that pool, and it was always the same set of workers. And the obvious thing there is, for example, if you've got a database deployment and you want integrated security for your workers, then you'd want different workers in prod and dev and whatever else, and you couldn't really do that. So the way I've got to doing this is that you can now scope worker pools. So here I've got a dev worker pool, which is scoped to only be available for environments for deployments in dev. The default worker pool is not ever able to be scoped, so it's always available for deployments to any environment. And then on your deployment process, you sort of get three options really, or two options. You get what was always there before, which was to select a pool explicitly. So you can either have nothing, or you can select one of the pools to run on. Of course, if you select the prod pool and you try and deploy it to dev, then it's your deployment's going to fail because you can't use the prod workers in dev. So that's the way number one, like you always could before. And now you can also have a worker pool type variable and pick one of the worker pools for your worker pool variable and then scope it to an environment. So here I've got a worker pool called pool. Then the dev worker pool is obviously scoped to the dev environment and the prod worker pool is scoped to prod. And then in your process, you can select the pool directly. So use a pool variable. So you've got, you can still select pools directly. You can select pools off variables. And then here I just did a little example of one where the step that only runs in prod then can still use the prod worker pool. So when you run that, for example, when I run it in dev, in my little dev environment, if we look through the raw thing, we can see that we pulled out a worker from the dev worker pool for that task. Whereas if we run it in the same thing in prod, we get things out of the prod worker pool instead. So using that, you can then get different workers in different environments. And even because it's on variables, you can get different workers depending on whatever you like on the variable. I've had a couple of different goes at different ways that sort of thing could work, but that seems to be the most, sort of the simplest and most consistent way is to just scope the pools to environments. And then when you run the process, you can only use pools for the environment you're deploying to, but you can also then select variables based on a worker pool type variable. So that's a couple of changes that are in. What's not in here is the corresponding permissions and restrictions on those worker pools. So you would expect, for example, a worker pool like this one that's only scoped to production, that then if you didn't have visibility into production, you probably shouldn't be able to see that worker pool. I'm not 100% sure how to solve that one yet, so I'm happy to take all kinds of input. At the moment, there's not that many permissions around workers because we started out with this idea that workers and worker pools were this global thing. So everybody can see every worker pool. But once we start to do this, I guess we've got a choice between introducing all the edit, add, delete, etc. permissions like we normally do. So you'd end up with like a worker pool, edit, create, delete, view sort of permissions. Or we could just say, well, if you've got permission to view prod environment, then that's probably about the same as permission to see that there exists a worker pool in that environment. So if you were editing a deployment process and you could see the production environment, then you could also see the worker pools that you could drop on the step as well. I think I'm not 100% sure which of those is best, so happy to take comments. And yeah, that's all the little bits that are there now for this.